Anyway, listen, I don't want you guys to think that this is a sermon that's about death. I don't want that to be like you walking out of here. I don't want you guys to walk out of here saying, oh, well, that was a lovely death sermon. And I feel like I need to say that because we're going to talk about death a lot. We're at the end of the sermon series. For the last 6 weeks, we've been talking about the life of Timothy, and I just figured, we get to the end, we might as well talk about him dying. And so we're going to talk about Timothy's death. As part of that, we're going to end up talking about Paul's death. So there's a lot of death talk of what we're going to talk about. But I don't want you guys to walk out and be like, oh, that was that sermon where Drew talked about death, because that's not what this sermon's about. This sermon is not remotely about death. Death is involved, okay? Death is a factor. Death is part of it. But this is not about death at all. This is actually a sermon about a lunch lady. I want you guys to walk out of here saying, well, that was a great sermon, Drew, about a lunch lady. So when you go to school, there's people theoretically that are supposed to always be role models. Like theoretically speaking, when you go to school, particularly by the time you get to high school and you're 14, 15, 16 and you're able to kind of recognize who is and is not somebody that you should try to be like. Theoretically speaking, at school, everybody should be somebody you should want to be like. And so the whole thing, like we always tell kids, like, well, if you have trouble at home, you should tell a trusted adult at school. And I think the idea is you're supposed to be able to trust any and every adult you encounter, theoretically. And so a lot of times when you talk to people say like, oh, well, I had this role model in school, looking back in my high school, like I had somebody that, this adult really meant a lot to me. They really taught me some things. They really, helped me to become the person that I am. They really showed me the kind of person I should be. And that's normal and that's healthy and that's good. But there is a distinct pecking order to who it is that we see as role models. Theoretically, everybody should be a role model, but practically speaking, the truth of the matter is that, we don't usually see everybody as a role model. So at the top of the list of the people we usually see as role models in, high school particularly is where we're going to focus here. Coaches, top of the list. A coach. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to in my years that they talk about how this coach was this wonderful role model, just changed everything for them. And the way it usually works for the coach is they didn't like the coach at first because the coach was gruff. The coach had kind of a hard exterior. Like the coach made them run laps, and they didn't want to run laps. And the coach, they wanted to just have fun, but the coach, this isn't about fun. This is about working hard. The coach punished the whole team because one kid that was always late kept showing up late. And you just think, oh, this coach doesn't like me. But then you win the big game and you see a single tear from the coach. And you realize the coach, well, that was just tough love. He loved me all along. And so that coach, we love that coach. So that's number one on the list. There's a reason we make movies about coaches all the time. Like Mighty Ducks, Coach Carter, Remember the Titans. These are all like Hoosiers. Go watch Hoosiers. It's always on the coach. So coach, number one on the list, always that. If not, there'll be another movie out next year. So number two on the list, teachers, okay? But it's not every teacher. I'm really sorry. I know a lot of teachers. My mom was a teacher. I'm friends with a lot of teachers. Not every teacher can be the cherished role model forever. Because if you're the shop teacher, nobody's inspired by the wood block you made into a pencil holder. Nobody's remembering that forever. No offense. So that's the way that is. And so also I've never heard anybody be like, yeah, I had this physics 2 teacher as a junior. He changed my life. No, people like physics 2 was awful. That was a hard class. I didn't like that. So if you're going to be a teacher that's going to be inspirational, what you really need to be is a cool history teacher that references historical figures and also TikTok in the same sentence. That's what you need. Or you could be an English teacher and you can quote that 15% of Shakespeare that anyone understands. People seem to like the English teachers for that. So teachers can be that. And so, you got your coaches, you've got your teacher. If you're me in my high school, third on the list was the librarian. though that wasn't because of anything she did. I just had this giant crush on the librarian. And here's why. Obviously, she was attractive. That's not the point. It was more her personality, because my librarian in my school hated her existence. Like, I was a librarian assistant, and like, she hated her job. I don't know why she had it. But she hated going to school every day. She hated being there. She hated the students. She hated me. And I could relate to that on just a spiritual level at 16 of like, I hate my existence as a junior in high school. So like, I just thought she was the bee's knees. That was great. But the point is, we have, people we usually thank, as we grow up in high school. And look, maybe it's not a teacher, maybe it's not a coach, maybe it's like a counselor, maybe it's like the principal, although it's probably going to be the vice principal, because principals are usually in their office and the vice principals are usually out mingling with the kids. You probably like the vice principal more than the principal. But we got a pecking order is my point. And usually, we can say thank you to these people, and we remember them for our whole lives. But we never really thank the lunch lady. Like, I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say, like, well, I want to be like the lunch lady. Even when we try to thank people who are not usually thanked, we always thank the janitor in that case. Like, if you're thinking, I want to thank the person that nobody ever notices, then we say, oh, the janitor. And that's just it. So that's where we're at. And look, we should always thank the janitor. Do you have any idea how much work they do? Like, always thank the janitor. I'm not saying we don't, but I'm saying the lunch lady gets overlooked all the time. But not in my school. Because the person that I remember most that I want to be like was the lunch lady at my school. So there's this one lunch lady, and there were really two jobs a lunch lady could do that I could see. There was the giving of the food, the distribution of the food, and then there was the cash registering. And, she really, no matter what it was that she was doing, she really exhibited the same qualities. So like when she was giving away food, she always remembered what we liked, and she always gave us extra when it was our favorite, which is crazy. I had like 2,000 kids in my school. How did she do that? Like for me, my favorite was and remains Salisbury Steak Day. Salisbury Steak Day is the best day in school lunch days. And so always this lady would give me extra mashed potatoes, and on specific days, man, she might even give you an extra roll. And that was gold, because those rolls were gold. Those were amazing. And so that was it. And she would remember, like, I like Salisbury steak, somebody else maybe likes the chicken nuggets, somebody else maybe likes the pizza, but she would remember who you were, what you liked, and make sure to give you extra all the time. And I was always amazed by that. But even beyond that, like when she was at the cash register and she wasn't giving you, she wasn't giving you food, she also remembered like who you were as a person at the cash register. Like she would ask who you were, like how your classes were doing. She'd ask how your grades were doing. Like if you had like a test, like she would know like, hey, how did that test go? Like she just remembered everything. And no matter what happened, I mean, for years, I knew this lady, and she was kind, and she was generous, and she was thoughtful, and she was caring. And school was hard. Like high school was hard for a lot of reasons. Like the classwork wasn't, but the social stuff was, and just like for me, like all this stuff was. High school was tough, and this lady was like this shining light, like this beacon of kindness every single day that I saw this lady, right? And I want to be like her when I grow up. And I'll tell you why. Because no one thanks that lady. Like no one remembers that lady. I promise you, no one else in my school is telling a story about this lunch lady right now. I mean, if they are, that'd be really, coincidence. But nobody noticed this lady. And you think, well, Drew, you noticed, right? I never knew her name. I never bothered to ask, I don't think. Or maybe I did. It's been a while now. I've been out of high school a while. Maybe I did, and then I just immediately forgot it when I left high school. Like, I remember all this other stuff, but I don't remember her name. I did not bother to remember what this woman's name was. Like, I can say all day that I cared and I appreciated, but I never knew what her name was. She was that sort of invisible to me and to everyone else that, I don't know if she was married. I don't know if she was a Mrs. or a Miss. I got no idea. But you see, I want to be like that lady when I grow up. I want to be like that lunch lady. And I want to preach a sermon about that lunch lady. Specifically because nobody ever says thank you. And specifically because that never mattered. She was not being kind to us students because we were easy to be kind to. You've hung out with high school kids. She was also not being kind to us high school students because she had to be. No one else was like this. She was not kind to us high school students because any of us were saying thank you, or she was getting anything from it, or, there was some kind of reward, or there was some sort of I don't know if they give awards for Lunch Lady of the Year, but she was not eligible. Nobody was nominated, nobody cared. She was being kind for the sake of kindness. She was being nice for the sake of niceness. She was being generous for the sake of generosity. She was doing the right thing when nobody was paying attention, when nobody was watching, when no one was saying thank you, when nobody cared. The right thing for the right thing's sake is what she did every single day. And now we can talk about Paul dying. So there's a lot we could say about the Apostle Paul dying. It's a long story. But we'll just condense it for the sake of our conversation today. And just say this: the Apostle Paul died under the rule and the reign of an emperor named Nero. Now, we've talked about Nero a lot. We talked about Nero just a few weeks ago. We'll just make sure we're all up to speed and we're all, kind of on the same page here when we talk about this, okay? So just kind of a little quick recap. There was a fire in Rome that destroyed about a third of the city in 64 AD. The emperor at the time was named Nero. And Nero had himself a political problem. He was exceedingly unpopular, and people hated him so much that they thought, well, I bet he set the fire himself for personal gain. The third of the city that got destroyed was sort of the poorer district, and they thought that he, had lit the fire and, wiped out the homes of the poor people so he could build up his own stuff, is what they thought. Now, I don't know if that's what Nero did. But the fact that that's what people thought of Nero tells you everything you need to know about why Nero had to figure out a way to, deflect blame off of him. Everyone just looked at Nero and assumed, well, that's the sort of thing he would do. By the way, it was the sort of thing he would do. I don't know if he did, but that was neither here nor there. So there's this fire, and he has a political problem. It's not just now the people who think this about him, because they don't care about what the people think, but his political rivals, they now are using this as an opportunity to try to get at him. And so Nero realizes, I have to do something to deflect blame, and he finds this small little, very unpopular religious cult to the Romans called the Christians. And he says, I know, I'll just blame them. And I know what I'll do then. I'll not just blame them, but I will punish them. And by punish, remember, Nero's the sort of guy everybody assumes could, light a third of the city on fire. To punish people, he just slaughtered them, just wholesale slaughtered Christians. From 64 AD to 68 AD, it was a systematic execution of thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians in some of the worst ways possible. There was crucifixion, there were wild animals tearing people apart. He was lighting people on fire, sort of like the fire, you set a fire, I'll set a fire. And there was also beheadings. And so the Apostle Paul was one of those who was killed, and he was beheaded under the reign of Nero, which is interesting for a few reasons. So by the time that Nero is in office, by the time he is the Caesar, the Apostle Paul is a few things. Number one, he's in Rome, which is already strange. Because let's just say this. We know from history that it was illegal to be a Christian, the entire empire. But really the only place they enforced it, the only place they were killing people was the city of Rome. You could really just leave the city and you'd be fine. And yet Paul stayed in Rome throughout Nero's reign. Not only that, but if you were going to kill a Christian, you'd want to kill a guy like Paul. You see, Paul is, at this point in history, just like he is at our point in history, the most famous Christian that has ever existed. Paul was the sort of guy that everyone knew. And I don't know that Nero exactly knew his face, but I know that he knew Paul's name. Paul was notorious in Rome for just being the guy who is the face of this cult, of this movement. He was the guy who was preaching and teaching. He was the guy who was planting the churches. He's just the guy everybody knows. He's also the guy who keeps getting arrested. Like, we know of a couple of imprisonments of Paul, but one of the fun things about Paul's life is trying to track how many times he's in prison. And it's really impossible to do. It just seems like most of the time he's in prison. Scholars argue about how often he's arrested. I mean, he's constantly arrested by the Romans, by other people. And so everybody knew who this guy was. Furthermore, the entire point of killing Christians was not just, to kill Christians. That wasn't the point exactly. This was a political game. It was, hey, Romans, I am so serious that I did not start this fire, that I will kill the people who did, and they are Christians. And so that's why the executions were public. That's why the executions were widely known. This was not just about killing. This was about sending a message. And there would have been no greater message than killing Paul, because he's the leader. He's the most famous one. There's nothing more politically advantageous than killing Paul. So to review, we have Paul in the city that he's going to get killed if he hangs out because he's a Christian, but also because he's Paul, he's also the guy that's like enemy number one on Nero's list to try to kill. Finally, the other side of that fame coin is that Paul could have gone literally anywhere in the Roman Empire and found a house to put him up in. I'm actually not sure. I was thinking about this week. I did a little bit of looking. I'm not totally sure. But by the time Paul dies, I'm not sure there is a Gentile church on the planet that does not have a connection to him. Either he planted it or one of his companions planted it. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe there's one and we just don't know about it in history. It's not in the Bible. It's not in church history anywhere, in the traditions or anything. But it's entirely possible that every church that is comprised of Gentiles, not Jewish people, in the world has a tie to Paul. We're talking dozens and dozens, hundreds of communities of Christians. We're talking, I don't even know how many thousands of Christians. Paul could have knocked on any door anywhere, and they said, oh, it's Paul, come on in. Which means Paul is in Rome, the most dangerous place to be. He is Paul, the most dangerous person to be. He also has like a free get out of jail card anywhere he goes that's not Rome. And yet, Paul stays in Rome and gets beheaded. Like, he could have left at any point. He could have done anything other than what he did. Like, if he went through, like if there was, 10 doors at his disposal, there's 10 doors at his disposal, one gets him killed, the other 9 don't. And he chose the door that got him killed. So now we need to talk about Timothy. Timothy is in Ephesus during the reign of Nero. Timothy is not, he's not in Rome. He receives, the couple letters we think probably came from Rome, but one of them definitely came from Rome. But, he is in Ephesus. He's doing ministry. Paul, he was, Paul's helper, and Paul says, look, as we talked about in the series, Ephesus is this really unique situation. It's this really unique place. It's a really difficult place to do ministry. So I need you to stay here and be the preacher here to lead the church. And so while Paul is beheaded, Timothy ends up surviving it. Like, he ends up surviving Nero, and Nero dies in 68, and we have relative peace, at least somewhat, in the empire for a couple decades. But there's never any peace, really, in Ephesus. As, again, we've talked about during the series, just to get ourselves back up to speed. Ephesus was a particularly difficult place to do ministry because Ephesus was the place where they worshipped Artemis. And when I mean they worshipped Artemis, I mean they said Artemis, this deity, this Roman and Greek goddess, Diana in Roman and Greek is Artemis. They saw Artemis as their identity. Everything they were as people were wrapped up in their worship of and their relationship to Artemis. Which is why one of the biggest structures in the world, one of the biggest buildings in the world at the time was the temple to Artemis in Ephesus. Forget the one of the biggest temples. I mean, this is one of the biggest structures of any kind. This thing is giant. And they did that. They built it like 3 times, just making it bigger and bigger and bigger, because that's how they saw Artemis. They just saw her as everything. The men, the women, the children. Everyone had a unique place, a unique relationship with Artemis. It's why when Paul very first showed up to Ephesus and tried to preach, there was a full-on riot. A full-on riot. People angry that anyone would preach a deity that, Jesus, you're supposed to follow Jesus as the only God, Jesus is the only king. And that, they couldn't get past that, okay? You can't worship Jesus as the only anything because we are the people who worship Artemis. And so there was a giant riot. It was violent. It was bloody. It was awful. For Timothy to have lived life there, he had to have gotten very used to being around people who didn't like him. I mean, he got very used to people that, there was hostility and there was tension and there were people that didn't want him there. And yet Timothy, for 30 years at Ephesus, decides, I'm going to show you guys love. What I'm saying is Timothy is a guy who understood that there's certain lines you don't cross, right? Like, we live in a culture where Artemis is everything. Everybody worships Artemis except for us. Like 99.99% of people worship Artemis, and then there's us. He knew that. He knew you have to be respectful. In fact, we can see from the first letter of Timothy from Paul to Timothy, that Paul actually has Timothy arrange and order the church leadership structure in such a way that they are respectful to and also understanding the cost of the way things are in Ephesus. It changes the church, in other words. Timothy knows that. He knew that. He got it. And so one day, as an old man, at a time when everybody else should be retired, and Timothy is this old man, not retired, still doing ministry, there was a feast day to Artemis, basically like Christmas and the 4th of July, all wrapped up in Ephesus. And Timothy looks at the situation, and he knew, if I stay in my house, if I say nothing, if I do nothing, everything will be fine. I've lived here for 30 years. Everybody knows me. I get it. I'll be fine as long as I keep to myself. And so there was this feast. And this particular feast got to be, there's no delicate way of saying it, it went from a holiday into a drunken orgy. And when the drunken orgy began, Timothy said, I'm going to go protest this. Grabbed himself a sign, went out into the city, and he protested. And he told the people, what you're doing isn't right. We've lived at peace for 30 years. This isn't right. And it turns out, if you try to stop people from participating in a drunken orgy in the middle of the drunken orgy, it doesn't go well. And so they beat him, they drug him through the streets, they stoned him, and he was executed. And that's how Timothy dies. Now, those are pretty different stories, right? Those are pretty different, accounts of what happened. But the link there is that both Paul and Timothy's deaths were entirely unnecessary. Entirely. Both Paul and Timothy could have avoided dying through just the minimal level of effort. There are lots of cities in the ancient world. If you're in any of them as Paul, if Paul is in any of them, other than Rome, he lives. He chose the one where he died. Timothy literally had to do nothing. Just stay in. Stay in your house. Or don't even stay in your house. Go hang out with your buddies. Do literally anything but protest the drunken orgy going on around. All you have to do is not that. You literally do nothing, do anything other than protesting, and you are fine. and yet he protested, and yet he died. You see, here's the thing. Here's the important thing we have to see. This is not about death. This is about life. Paul and Timothy both lived and died by the very same principles. Paul and Timothy were the same people in every circumstance, whether it was convenient or whether it was not, whether it cost them or whether it did not, whether anybody said thank you or whether anybody didn't say thank you, whether it was life or death or whether it was just a random Tuesday. For Paul, this Nero thing, the government always hates Paul. That's what it means to be Paul. It's for the government to hate you. For Paul to do his ministry, it means to do your ministry while the government hates you, while you're being hunted. Paul is in and out of prison all the time. Paul is in and out of being arrested all the time. It just is what it is. And Paul still preached the gospel, no matter what. Paul still baptized. Paul still planted churches. Paul still showed the love of God to everyone, no matter what. And in the end, doing that cost him his life. But there was no difference between what got him killed and what he did for years before. Timothy preached to people that didn't like him. Preached to people that didn't want him there. Timothy, can you imagine the abuse he took for 30 years in a place where there's a dominant religion that thinks you are blaspheming against not just their religion, but their nationality? This is about nationalism as much as about anything else. Timothy was insulting their culture, insulting their history, insulting their people, their ethnicity, their heritage. And for 30 years, he smiled and he preached. And one day he crossed a line that he probably knew he shouldn't cross. And they killed him. But see, here's the thing. It's not about their death. They died as they lived. They were unflinching in their convictions, in their faith, in their principles. And because they were unflinching in their principles, when a situation arose that could get them killed, they didn't flinch. Because to them, principles were not things that they stood for only when it was easy. Principles were principles, which means they were fixed things. They were who they were no matter what. Which is to say this. In the second letter that's from Paul to Timothy, towards the tail end of Nero's reign, shortly before Paul loses his head. This is the advice he gives him in the last part of the book. Paul tells Timothy, he says this, you should keep a clear mind in every situation. Don't be afraid of suffering for the Lord. Work at telling others the good news and fully carry out the ministry God has given you. As for me, my life has already been poured out as an offering to God. The time of my death is near, and I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I have remained faithful. It almost sounds like Paul's bragging here. And maybe to a degree he is. But I think he deserves to brag. He actually later on in the text, he's talking about these other people who all left. People who escape. They escape the persecution. They leave and they don't end up dying with him. Paul is Timothy's one of the only guys who stands with him the whole time. Paul deserves to brag about being a man of principle, unflinching and unwavering. You see, here's the thing, guys. This is not a sermon about death. It is so important. Growing up in the church, man, I'm not saying it's wrong to do this, but I got the impression that the best thing you could ever do for Jesus was die. In history, there was martyrs, and we always talked about the martyrs, and then we would talk about missionaries, and the Columbine thing happened. You guys remember Cassie Bernal? Was that her name? And she dies, for faith, essentially. That whole thing happens, And like she's held up as the example of like, look at what faith is. And then looks, in no way am I disrespecting any of that. The idea was, the best thing you could do is die. But I don't think that's true. I think the message of the martyrs is the best thing you can do is die as you've lived. Even Jesus is like the first Christian martyr, if we fudge the numbers a little. Jesus dies for his faith. Again, very simplistic way of looking at it, but Jesus says, I could not die, but I'm choosing to die here, right? Like I could stop this, I'm choosing not to stop. Jesus is a martyr for how he is communicating God to us, right? But if Jesus doesn't show us God for 3 years, if Jesus is not the Word of God, if he is not the exact representation of God, if he is not the visible image of the invisible, if all those things are not true about Jesus, who cares if he's crucified? Man, the Romans killed hundreds of people like every month. Like I don't know how many a day, but like they killed all sorts of folks. If Jesus isn't God, if Jesus doesn't live as he lives to show us not only who he is, but how we should live, it simply doesn't matter that he died. Jesus' death has significance and weight because of Jesus' life. And I think it's so important we say that. Because we can get this idea, well, the best thing we can do for Jesus is die. No, the best thing we can do for Jesus is live. And if that costs us, well, I guess it costs us. But see, the point is not about death. The point is that Paul and Timothy died as they lived, men of unflinching principles, men who would not be moved by circumstance. And I want to be like that. I want to be like that lunch lady. Nobody ever said thank you to her. I mean, back when I was in high school, she was making like $4.50 an hour, probably. $4 an hour. I think minimum wage became $5 when I was like a junior or senior. Like, this wasn't like, I mean, this was not a job that gave many rewards. Her being kind did not have many rewards other than simply the reward of being kind. And yet she was kind. Day in, day out, unflinching in her principles. I think so often, and especially as we've talked this series, we've talked about a helper, right? As we finish this whole thing, as we finish this conversation, as we look at, okay, so Mr. Rogers said that, when life is scary, we should look for helpers, and Timothy was Paul's helper. We look at all this stuff. Guys, as we just get real specific, this is what we need to take away from this whole series. The world is in desperate need of people who will help. But the way we do that can be very difficult sometimes. Because it is hard to be that lunch lady. It is hard to be Paul and Timothy. It is hard to follow Christ. But that's the goal. And so our sixth and our final lesson from our series called The Helper is simply this. We help when we do the right thing. No matter what, no matter who notices, all the time. We help when we do the right thing. No matter what, no matter who notices, all the time. This morning, musicians are going to come forward. We are going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week to take God up on this offer. It's an offer of knowing Him, of us, of life that's eternal, that is here, that is forever, that all of the Bible teaches that we are to repent and be baptized. It sounds like two things. Promise is just one. When we repent, that word simply means to change. God wants us to change our minds and our attitudes away from being the people that we would be without Him, and instead we're called to be the people who seek out His ways and His will every time, the right thing. In baptism, it's a picture of that. As we go down in the waters, as we come out of the water, it's like ourselves being put to death and being born again, raised again, just as Christ with. We align ourselves with Christ. We join ourselves to Christ, and we are with Him. If you've never made the decision, we got a nice warm baptistry. All sorts of people can do it. Let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ looking for a perfect church home, this is not it. But we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up. We do it. And as hard as it may sound, We want to be like that lunch lady. We want to be like Paul. We want to be like Timothy. We want to help in this world by doing the right thing all the time, no matter the cost, no matter what. As we stand,